It's Thursday, the 13th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story. Tinubu's re-election. ACF. Others tackle Ganduje over no vacancy comments. Babachia hints at not consensus candidates as ACF Mohammed counter APC chair. You can get all of this story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Tariff hike. Labour. Subscribers plan telcos shutdown March 1. You can get the complete story on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. Tax reform. Reps divided as bills scale first reading. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Federal government may ban trucks as tanker fire claims 493. You can get the complete story on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. Abia PDP chapter defies NWC order. Autumn, Ayanwu face panel March 4. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story. Tony Elumelu Foundation partners UAE entities to empower African entrepreneurs. You can get the complete story on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. APC hires private firm for membership e-registration. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the Punch newspaper. Hoodlums in court for abducting policeman in Ondo. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Punch newspaper. Reps summon customs CG over officers' retirement. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard. The leading story. Tariff hike. NLC firms gives March 1. Alert to short telecom services. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Vanguard and above the leading story. National grid collapse triggers widespread darkness. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. Tax regime. Civil servants pay more than increase in minimum wage, says NLC. You can get the complete story on page 26 of the Vanguard. PDP NWC affirms Udo Koye as National Secretary. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Why Atiku Wike aren't before us, says PDP Disciplinary Committee. You can get the complete story on page 26 of the Vanguard. Reps pass tax reform bill for second reading. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Tanker fires. Federal government moves ban on trucks with 60,000 liters capacity. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard and below the leading story from the left. Poisonous gas. 10 students hospitalized as Ibadan Poly probes incident. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. 124 journalists killed worldwide in 2024. Says CPJ. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. 2026 FIFA World Cup. Super Eagles must secure World Cup spot, says Okbara. You can get the complete story on page 32 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, Nigeria Tribune. The leading story. Tax reform bill survive in reps. Scale second reading. Lawmakers back NGF's position on VAT sharing formula. 50% equity, 20% population, 30% derivation. Kick against issuance of exemption orders to boost revenue generation. Back existence of third fund, Naseni Nitda. You can get all of this story on page 16 of the newspaper. And above the leading story, LG pool, how Osun APC lost at the Court of Appeal. You can get the complete story on page 4 and 5 of the Tribune and below the leading story from the left. PDP NWC confirms Udo Koye as National Secretary. Transmit name to INEC. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the newspaper. Senate scrapes special fund account for regional development commissions, says NYSC. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the newspaper. IBEDC reconnects UCH. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Tribune. Catholic bishop denounced resurgence of herdsmen's attack in Southwest, tells governors on security. You can get the complete story on page 15 of the newspaper. How Juke Barkhot, who lived for books, writers, died in his Ibadan home. You can get the complete story on page 17 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. The leading story. Tax reform bills. Reps want continuous section of expurge. Seek clarity on conflict with constitutional provisions. Oppose inheritance tax. Propose VAT reduction. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Bandits adopt 16. Burn houses. Crops in Kaduna community. You can get the complete story on page 29 of the newspaper. 49 years on, Murtala's legacy is still visible. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. Egypt's president may shun talks with Trump over Gaza. You can get the complete story on page 26 of the newspaper and below the leading story. 50% tariff hike. Labour threatens telecom mass shutdown. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. Lassa fever kills 12 in Ondo. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the newspaper. Court adjourns Professor Yusuf's bail ruling to February 27. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. 124 journalists killed in 2024, says CPJ. You can get the complete story on page 26 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian. The leading story. Importers divert cargo to Togo. Others to evade tariff hike. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. Group laments over 5,000 Nigerians stranded in Iraq. You can get the complete story on page 4 of The Guardian. 124 journalists killed in 2024. Israel mostly responsible, says CPJ. You can get the complete story on page 4 of The Guardian and above the leading story from the left. Businesses, homes count losses as national grid collapses again. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Revert to old tariff before March or face total strike. NLC tells government, telecom operators. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Edo Electional Tribunal. PDP alleges conflicting testimonies. APC to present 28 witnesses. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian and below the leading story from the left. Tinubu meets Google, wants Nigeria to drive Africa's AI evolution. You can get the complete story on page 15 of The Guardian. Kanu uncovers multiple illegal private financial accounts. You can get the complete story on page 28 of The Guardian. Tax reform bills advance amidst pushback on phasing out key agencies. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. Moving over to the next paper, Business Day. The leading story. Universities demand 1.5 million naira in medical courses racket. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper and below the leading story from the left. Nigeria's cold storage crisis opens 160 billion naira opportunity. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. More Nigerians to celebrate Valentine as luxury spending grows. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Disease-resistant treatment fuels $50 million investment. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.